Okay, in the last video, we actually managed to install and set up Python in our system. In this video, we're going to be going through some of the things that you need to know for Python, and I'll tell you what those are in just a minute. First of all, let's open command prompt. Now, in command prompt, we looked at a command last time to check if Python was installed. Now let's do that again, just to double sure that Python's successfully installed in our system. So Python, the command is Python space 22 version, hyphen version, and when you click enter, if the version does pop up, that means it has installed. If it doesn't, go back to my other video and install it again, and try rebooting your system and wait till the version pops up. Now once that happens, we can actually go into our video today, which is actually learning the basics of Python. Today we're going to be starting off with data types, some of the basic syntaxes that you need to know, and a function that's really important in Python. So first of all, let's just close the command prompt, because we know now that Python has installed. Just open a new command prompt, and in this we need to type Python. So our command prompt sets the screen to Python console, which means that we can type up our Python code in that console, and then we can write our code in it. So let's just type up Python. It's as simple as that, and then when you click enter, you will see that it says Python 3.8.6 RC1, or the version you've got, and then a bunch of other stuff which we'll be looking into later. Now, here we can type our code up. Now we've got Python ready. Let's start looking at the important function I was telling you about. Now, the important function I was telling you about was the print function. And what the print function does, it's in its name. It prints whatever you put in the brackets of the print function. Let me show you what I mean. So first, let's go to Notepad. And let's actually open Notepad up. And here, I'm going to be showing you how does the print function look. So if you ever see something like this, so print function looks like this. So this is a function that you use to print something. Now you can't just print whatever you want by putting it in this bracket right here. So you would put something in here, but you can't just put anything you want to print in there, because it has a few things that you need to do before you print something, and we have to learn about those things and how we put in there, because we're only going to be putting 4 kind of data types in there, right? So before we go into knowing what we put inside the print function, let's first learn about data types. Now, data types are nothing but types of data, right? It's in the name. Now, how many types of data are there in Python? There is a string, there's an integer, there's a float, and there's a boolean. So those are the 4 data types, that you have in Python. Okay, so let's look into each one step by step, right? First up, starting with a string. Let me just put the font size up so you guys can see. Let's just change that to this much. Right, so string. What is a string? String is basically a word, right? A word. Now there's like no proper definition for a string. It's just all lead up to this part. It's basically like a word. So if you were to say Python, that would be a string, right? That would be a string. As long as, now, a word in Python is only a string as long as it's in quotes, right? If it's in quotes, you know that it's a string. But in case if it's not in quotes, it's not a string, right? So if you ever declare a string, it will have to be in quotes. So you would put whatever you want as a string in these quotes, right? So for example, even the print function. If you wanted to print a word or a string that you've not defined yet in our Python code, you would have to put that as a string. right? If I were to print Mithalish, I would have to put those in strings because it's a word that I've not declared yet. But what do I mean by declaring? By declaring, I mean like a variable. So, we're not going to be looking into all about variables because they're a little bit more complex, but we're going to be getting the basic idea of what it is so that it kind of helps us understanding what a string is and a bunch of other data types, right? So, a variable is completely off topic, right? Variable is nothing to do with data types, but a variable does store one of those 4 data types that I told you, an integer, string, a boolean, or a float, right? So, a variable, you've probably heard this in maths or something like that. If you haven't heard of it, it's just like a place where you store a name, an integer, a float, or a boolean value. So I could just store a variable, for example, I could just, if I could type, that would be great. Example, I could just say name equal to Mithalish. Now, I need to put Mithalish in a string because that is a word that I have not declared yet as a variable. So because it's the value of a name, a variable, it will have to be in one of those 4 data types. Mithalish is a word, so I will just put that in a string. Right? So that's what I mean when I said declared it somewhere. So I could, if I wanted to print Mithalish, I don't always have to just say print Mithalish, right? I don't have to always say print Mithalish. I could just say name because I don't have to put name in single quotes because it's a variable. So we don't have to put name in string or any kind of variable. We don't have to put in string when we're trying to print it, right? So that comes under a variable. So that's what a variable is. Now, let's try to declare a few variables of string. So I could just say age is equal to whatever age I have, and then I could say, for example, I could say that's it really, yeah. And those are the 2 examples that you need to know. Now, age, which brings me to the next data type. Age has to be a whole number or a float, right? Most of the time it's a whole number. It would probably be like, let's just say 12. My age is 12 and my name is Mithalish, right? So, this is an integer. So if I were to print an integer, I could just put 12 straight up and it would print 12 because an integer doesn't need quotes either. You can just print it directly in the brackets. Yes, and I can also declare an integer as a variable. So if I said age, print age, it would print the age 12, right? I could just say print name, and it would print a string though. It would print a string because we saved the value of that variable as a string. Okay? So now we've looked at an integer, and let me just write that down so it's nice and clear. So integer. So integer is basically a whole, it's really important that you know this, it's a whole number, right? So the syntax for this is blank. So the syntax, this doesn't have a syntax. Integer doesn't need a syntax, right? So I could just say print 12, and I need no syntax for that. There's no syntax. I could just directly print 12. But in the case of a string, I'll need to put those quotes. Right, we've understood what a string is. We've understood what an integer is. Now let's go on to something a little bit more complex, which is a float. Now this is totally understandable. It's just a bit more harder than integer and string. Now float is basically a number with decimal, right? A decimal number is known as a float. If you don't know what a decimal is, it's just something like 3.5 would be a decimal because it's not a whole number, it's a whole number and a fraction of a value. So that would be counted as a decimal as long as it has a point. If I said 3.0, that would still be a float, right? Float and decimal are the same. So float is equal to decimal, right? It's always equal to decimal. Right, now what is the syntax for float? Guess what? There's no syntax for float as well. The syntax for float is nothing. So if I were to just say print, actually let me put that under here because, yeah, and then let's say print. If I were to print 3.7, let's just say, I won't need to put that in any kind of syntax because float does not have any syntax. Now, well, we understood what a float is, an integer, and a string. Let's go on to something a little bit complex than three of these, which brings me to Boolean. Now, what is a Boolean? Boolean sounds different, right? We've probably heard the word string, integer, float somewhere. But Boolean, we probably haven't heard of. Well, at least most of us. Boolean is basically a value which either is true or false. So you've probably heard the statements true or false before, right? That's what Boolean is. Now, Boolean doesn't have any syntax as well, so the syntax is empty. Now, these curly brackets just mention the syntax, and Boolean doesn't have any syntax, right? You could just put true or false straight up in the brackets, but with a few conditions. Now, a Boolean, if you're ever declaring a Boolean, you could just say print true with capital T, or print false with a capital F. They would be counted as a Boolean value, right? True and false are Boolean values as long as they've got a T as a capital and an F as a capital. Now, where are Booleans used? We're going to be looking into examples later, which we'll actually be doing some code in the Python console, but we're just understanding the definitions of these values. So, what is a Boolean? We've understood what a Boolean is. It's just basically a value which either is true or false, and it doesn't have a syntax. And if I were to print capital T true or capital F false, that will be counted as a Boolean type. Now, we've understood the basic definition of Boolean as well now, right? Let's just go through all of them one last time. This might be getting a little boring, but let's just go through one last time just to make sure that we've understood these, because these are really, really, really important in Python, right? These are the most important part in Python, data types, right? A string is basically a word that you would have to put syntax in quotes. Now, one more thing to go through is you could put these in this single quotes, or you could put the syntax in double quotes. Double quotes, right? You could put in single quotes or double quotes, it would still be counted as a string. And for example, we've got print Mythalash here, and this is a string that I haven't declared as a variable anywhere yet, so I have to put these in some quotes. Now, what's an integer? Integer is basically a whole number. It has no syntax. An example is print 12. So that is an integer. 12 is an integer. A float is basically a number with a decimal, and this has no syntax as well. And a float, we know that it's equal to decimal, so float and decimal are the same. And if we, for example, print 3.7, 3.7 is a decimal, so it's a float. Now, brings me to the last one, Boolean. Boolean is basically a value which either is true or false. And it has no syntax, for example, true and false. So these are the four data types. There's a little more complexity to these data types, so this is not just it. This is just a basic structure for us to understand. We'll go into the complex stuff later on, but this is all we need to understand as our basics. Now, we've also looked at a variable, right? A variable, for example, is name equal to Mythalish. So name's value is equal to Mythalish. So if you take some kind of word and set a value to it, that will be counted as a variable. Now, if you want to print a variable, right here, as you can see an example, you don't need to put that in any syntax as well. So a variable, let me just move this down, right? Let me just move all this down as well. So let me just put, right. Okay, so for example, variable is basically a name which has a value, Now the syntax for a variable, which I haven't told you yet, is nothing. So this variable has nothing as well. For example, as you can see, age, print, all these print functions don't have any syntax as variables. So we've understood what's a string, integer, float, boolean, and a variable. Now we're just going to be looking at the short forms of all these values. So a string has a short form, right? A string has a short form. And the short form for a string, let me just say, in this one, short form for a string is equal to str. So an str is known as a string. So if you've ever seen something like str, it basically means string in Python. Now the short form for, let me 1 second here. Okay, so a short form for integer is equal to int. So that is the short form for int. No capitals, by the way. Sorry, I put capitals here. There's no capitals in these short forms. And for float, the short form is nothing but float itself. So the short form is float. So this doesn't have a short form really. And for boolean, I already wrote the nickname here, but it doesn't have any capitals. So let me write that again. So let me just say this is equal to bool with no capitals, right? So these are the short forms. It's not really that necessary, but this is what will be known as. So just so that you don't get confused. So now we've looked at all these data types. Let's do an example here. When I mean example, let me just give you a little exercise and then we can check them in the Python console. I'm going to show you how to, right? I'm going to set a few names, values here, and you're going to tell me which one's an integer and which one is a boolean, which one is a string, and which one is a float. So let's go. So I'm going to say Python, comma, maybe 53, comma, 63.5, comma, true, comma, false. Okay, so I've set 4 data types, and I want you to tell me, pause the video and tell me which one is the data type. You can just leave a comment below if you want to. Okay, so let's go through them here. Now I'm not going to make this that boring and just tell you what's going on here. I'm going to actually put this in the Python console so that we're knowing which ones are data types and we can actually use the Python console and we can look at how it's used. So let me just minimize this here. Let me see if I can get this right. Okay, right, here we go. So first of all, we said here Python in quotes. Now we know this is a string because that's the syntax of it, but how do we check if a value is a string? Or how do we even check the type of a value, right? How do we check it? Now, you could just go to the Python console and the command for it is, you have to just print, to check the value, all you have to do is, there's a function called type, and the purpose of it is to check the data type of whatever you put in that braces. So I want to check the data type of quotes Python, right? So I would just put quotes and Python and enter. Okay, as you can see, it says class is a string. A class we'll look into later, but the important thing here is it says string. Remember those short form I told you that you need to understand? Yeah, this is it right here, because everything that Python says is in short form, so it would be a string. So if you said Python was a string, give yourself a pat on the back because that is a string, right? Now let's look at the next one. 53. Now what is 53? So we just put type again. So type. And we put 53 in and we enter and it's an int. So that means an integer. So if you said integer, you're correct. So let's just put that equal to an int. Now, we've got 63.5. Let's say type 63.5. And we click enter, and it says float. So that means a decimal, right? So if you got that as well, correct. You are correct. So it's float. Let me just take capitals off for this so there's no confusion. And we've got true and false, right? So let's check. So here I'm just going to say type true. And it says bool, which means a Boolean value. So it's a true or a false. So true is equal to bool, right? Is equal to a bool because we just saw. And we've got false left. So let's check the type of false. So type, we say false, and we click enter, and then you can see that is a Boolean value as well. So if you got all these correct, well done. You've completely understood the basics of data types, right? So this is very important to know, and in this video we've actually covered what are data types, how to check the values of data types, and how to actually use the Python console. In the next video we're going to be looking at something else, but this is very important, so if you've not understood this, please go back and listen to this video again because this is very important in Python.